Back to week 2. We are studying Understanding Judaism, the basics of deed and creed. Last week we did the first chapter and an introduction really to the book. So we have some new people with us, so I'm going to take just a minute to kind of recap where we are and what the point of the book is, and then jump into the second and third chapters tonight. So just for context, the whole series, the whole book, is about the essence of Judaism, the very foundations of what the religion is. And usually you would get that by going to a yeshiva for 15 years, 20 years of your life all day long. And as the times have changed, fewer people are doing that. And then during in the aftermath of the Holocaust, there was a strange phenomenon that many people started returning to Judaism. And they didn't have that foundation that they would usually get. This book was written by a professor, a rabbi who I had as a teacher at Yeshiva University, and it was meant to kind of get you up to speed on the very foundations, the very essence of the religion. And it's a very text-based book. We're going to go to a lot of sources. And the first idea that was taught was that all of the commandments all of them are considered equal. All equal. And usually we talk about, this is a big mitzvah, or that's a big sin. And that is the first myth out of many that he will bust in this book. And we discussed that the hardest mitzvah in the world is honoring your parents properly. And the easiest one is sending away the mother bird to retrieve the egg. That is considered the easiest one. And as we did in the first class, the hardest one and the easy one have the same exact reward for a long life, which actually means a long eternal life. So that's kind of just what we did last week. So before we start this week's class, I want to say that we are learning, and this tradition is to learn in the merit of something. We are learning in the merit of a speedy and full recovery for our friend Aviva Galia Basima, who hopefully will be watching the recording, and David as well. And I want to thank Jody Barris and the Park City Jewish Collective for putting this all together, and the Refreshments Committee. Sorry for those of you online. I know some of you online will be here next week, as well as the Audio-Video Committee, which is really making this possible for people to see it later on. So we know the context is to give you a kind of an essence of Judaism. Last week we really focused on all mitzvos being equal. This week, it really drives home that point. But one thing that the book does in this next chapter, or in these next two chapters, is it cites a lot of sources. It cites the Mishnah. It cites the Gemara. It cites something called Midrash. It cites the Shulchan Aruch. It cites Jewish preachers. So I just want to spend a few minutes, since we are talking about the essence of this, is what are those sources? How did we get them? Are they just made up by the rabbis, etc.? And there's a really unique system for Jewish law. It's like the oldest continuous law that we have. And we know that we got these, we talked about it last week, we got the 613 commandments, the mitzvos, from the Torah itself. But those have been interpreted and communicated to us through a very direct chain. And the text isn't changing, hasn't changed, never will change. It's one of the core beliefs of Judaism. But how the text is interpreted in the Jewish tradition is very unique, because when Moses got the Bible on Har Sinai, it is our tradition that he also received an oral version of it. The text is the text, but there was also an oral and more carefully explained, like long version. So in fact, the Torah is just kind of like the abridged version, and there's a tremendous oral law that has been passed down from generation to generation, continually, except around the end of the second or third century, the end of the 200s of the Common Era, the Jews were being so persecuted that there was a fear that this chain, directly from Moses, Sinai, directly to these people, that chain might be lost because of the persecution. So even though there was a standard that the oral law shall remain the oral law and never be transcribed, because we want it to be transmitted verbally and kept that way, it became necessary, and it was a controversial decision back in 291 or whatever year it was, to actually write it down. And the Judah the Nasi was the one who actually wrote this, and he wrote it in the form of, there was something called the Mishnah, and a lot of the text that we're going to be citing is from the Mishnah, and it's pretty much the closest direct source that we have, almost on parallel with the Torah, is the Mishnah that came from the oral law. That Mishnah, that oral law, was transcribed, but in shorthand. It didn't go into all the depth. So later generations in the Talmud that you've heard of, the Gemara, they had debates over what the Mishnah meant. Now, they weren't coming up with only their own reasoning. They were saying, well, here's what I was taught. Here's how it came from my father, whose father heard it from when Moses brought it down. So the Talmud is an explanation of what the Mishnah is saying, and often a disagreement and an argument over which interpretation we have. But there's also something called the Midrash, which is a little bit more of a storytelling approach that is kind of runs parallel with the Mishnah, and it was recorded, and we have the Midrash, which explains stories from the Torah that aren't in the Torah, but it's like the Torah transcribes what happened, but Moses really was there for all of it, and it's that information that passed down through the Midrash. So the Gemara, as we said, argues a lot about what the Mishnah meant. So there's one school of thought, Beis Shammai, and there's another school of thought, Beis Hillel. Those were two of the big ones. And those two traditions were often at odds. So the problem was, well, who do we agree with? So later on, after the Talmud, there is something called the Shulchan Aruch, or the Code of Jewish Law, which is really a codification not of the arguments or the reasoning, but just straight up, here's the law. So if you had a question today, what's the law, you would check the Shulchan Aruch. But we also have another phenomenon that we're going to cite in the book, which is best described as a Jewish preacher. And these were people who went around telling stories to help explain the laws. One of the most famous ones is someone that we're going to get into in the 3rd chapter, both from one of his stories in the book that really explains this whole idea of the mitzvos being equal. But I've got one of my own stories about him, or one of his stories that I want to share with you as well, that I think illustrates another style of Jewish learning, which is actually through humor. And there is some humor in this. And the other type of learning device that we have is fascinating. It's called gematria. And gematria is numerics. And in order to understand this, you have to understand that the Hebrew language is not like any other language, where words represent things. In Hebrew, the very letters of the words mean something, and then the combination of those words, those letters into a word, actually can stand for something and give it meaning. So you have to kind of throw out everything you know about language generally and recognize that the letters of each word and then the combination of those letters and that word isn't just the definition of the word, but those letters and the word represent the meaning of that word. And we'll get into an example of that. So as I promised, in this 2nd chapter, we're going to hopefully do 2 chapters today, we double down on this idea that the commandments are all equal, and that we don't put one in front of the other, and there's no big one or one little one. So going back to this idea, where the reason I did that first, the Mishnah and the Talmud, is because we're going to do some of that here, and we're actually going to study a little bit of Mishnah and a little bit of Talmud to give you a flavor, a taste of that style of learning. And I'll warn you, it's a little bit challenging. So when you see, like in a movie, you see people in a yeshiva sitting around learning and arguing, they're usually reviewing the Talmud and discussing it. And it's not a easy to do thing, but we're going to struggle through it together here to get a sense of it. So he writes that the halacha has codified this concept in a way that reflects both theology and legal stricture. The idea that all mitzvot are equal is the basis for a remarkable law. And we go back to this teaching of the Radbaz that we did last week, when you're held captive by a feudal lord and you only have one day a year to be free and practice your religion, and we talked about which day that should be. The Radbaz gave the answer, which is it should be tomorrow. It should be the next available day so that you don't have to choose between the different mitzvos. So here's the source. Going back to the Talmud first. The Talmud teaches that a person engaged in the performance of one mitzvah is exempt from fulfilling another. If you're in the middle of one mitzvah, for people like us with ADD, it's hard, right? Because you want to do everything at once. But if you are performing the will of God, a mitzvah, and then you say, oh, well, it's time to pray the morning prayer, you don't actually have to do it. And what we'll learn is you're not allowed to do it. So let's see what the source for this rather surprising law is. So one might assume that this means that one isn't required to leave one holy act for another. The Rashba from 1235 to 1310, he wrote, he and later authorities agreed that the legal ramifications go further. The dictum does not apply that one need not forsake one mitzvah for another, but that one is not permitted to abandon one religious act to fulfill another. And the source for this is a Mishnah. The Mishnah expresses this principle in very shorthand. Messengers of mitzvah are exempt from fulfilling the mitzvah of sukkah. So with that, there's this concept of something called a shliach mitzvah, someone who's on the way of doing something, delivering something for a mitzvah. In the case of the Mishnah, it's talking about, and this is maybe a sad commentary on our history, going to retrieve a hostage. And it is a mitzvah, and let's just think about this in today's context. It is a mitzvah to get a fellow Jew removed from captivity. And in this case, the case cited by the Mishnah, there was someone that was being held for ransom. And there was the case of a messenger who was sent long distances to secure the release of captives held for ransom. He found himself traveling at the time of the Sukkot holiday, where we would usually sit in that hut. And he faced the following dilemma. Should he interrupt his journey for the duration of the holiday in order to find a sukkah in a town or a city? Or should he continue on his holy mission afterward? Or should he ignore the demands of the holiday since he's already engaged in the mitzvah? And the answer is, it is to this situation that the Mishnah addresses itself. And it is in this situation that the commentators rule not only that the messenger may continue on his journey, if he so desires, but that he must do so and not leave one mitzvah for another. So imagine this, a very pious Jew is on an errand for a mitzvah. He skips the holiday if he can't complete that task in time. And not only does he have the freedom to skip the holiday, he must skip the holiday. I never learned that in Jewish day school, but it's very clear from the Mishnah. And the rationale, he writes, is obvious. To do otherwise would mean that, in this case, the messenger has concluded that the mitzvah he is presently fulfilling is less important than the one which he wants to turn. So if he wasn't in class last week, he might have thought, I have to do sukkahs. But if he was here last week, or if he watched the video, he would know, no, Rabbi Blech cited the Mishnah, that it's not for us to decide the importance of a mitzvah, one being bigger. And who am I to say, well, God told me to do two things, I'm doing one, but now I have to stop and do the other because the other one is a big one, right? I always thought it was a big one, big holiday. No, that's absolutely not the case. And we have that transmitted to us from the Mishnah, which comes directly from Moses, from the oral law, from the tradition that he received at Sinai. And it's not only in the case, and don't think that it only means, well, Sukkot isn't important and retrieving a hostage is important. And just to contextualize it for today, every soldier in Israel right now who is working to free the hostages is not only doing their national duty, but they're doing a mitzvah of working to release the hostages. And according to this, they would be exempt. I mean, many Israelis jumped into action on not on Sukkot, but that last day of that 8-day holiday on Simchat Torah, which in Israel is Shmini Atzeres, the 8th day. They jumped into action. They were not required to perform that holiday because there was that urgent task. You might argue, well, they don't have to do one because they were doing the other. I'll leave that to a rabbi to answer. But once they were doing that life-saving task, they weren't allowed to go do something else. They don't have to stop. Now, many of them you'll see videos, they're praying in the morning while they're on a break, and it's not interrupting the mission. They're not allowed to interrupt the mission, quote unquote, just to pray. But there are other cases as well. And the Talmud said, I'm quoting the Talmud, someone who is confronted with the death of a relative who he is responsible to bury, another mitzvah, another commandment, is exempt from the recitation of Stan's favorite prayer, Shema. So we're obligated to say Shema, but the Gemara, the Talmud says no, not if you are responsible for burying a family member. In fact, here too, the meaning is not only that in a person who has a living relative who finds himself in the time period from the death until the burial, not that he need not pray, but that he's not allowed to pray or fulfill other mitzvot. So we're going to delve in, and it really, I like this example because there's some Mishnah, the oral law, and then the Talmud that discusses it. The Mishnah says, those who are engaged on a religious errand are free from the obligation of sukkah. Okay, what does that mean, and how do we interpret that? Well, there's a Gemara, there's a Talmud that discusses it. And this is very typical language for the Talmud. From where do we know this? Right? What's your basis for saying that you don't have to do it? From what our rabbis taught, quote, when you sit in your house, and this is a quote from the Shema, from the next paragraph, when you sit in your house, and try to bear with me because it didn't make sense to me the first 4 times I read it, but we're going to work our way through it. When you sit in your house, quote unquote, when you sit in your house, that comes to exclude the man who is occupied with a religious duty. And then it says, when you walk on your way. So you have to say the Shema when you're sitting in the house and when you're walking on the way. When you're walking on the way. Sounds pretty simple. Either you're home or you're out. You got to say the Shema. They learn from this when it says, and when you walk on the way, it comes to exclude a groom. How so? So Rav Huna said in the Talmud, it is compared to the way, just as the way refers to a secular way. So must every act be secular for your own purpose. Thus, excluding such a man who is occupied with the performance of a religious duty. But does it not refer to where one is going on a religious errand also? And does not the divine law nevertheless say that one should read the Shema? If so, the verse should have said, when sitting and when walking. And the Gemara looks very carefully at the verse, and it says, when you sit and when you walk. Why did it say you? When walking for your own purpose, you are bound by the obligation. But when you're walking not for you, but on a religious duty, you are free. And for those of you who have ever seen any of the movies or where they're learning Talmud, there is a gesture that is famous. So when you get to that main point that really starts to explain it, you say, but when you're walking on your way, what does that mean? So there's a lot of gesture involved in studying the Talmud. So what does all that mean? We're reading every word. We're seeing a little bit of an extra word because it says when you walk on the way, as opposed to if it says when you walk on your way. If you're walking on your way, you're doing something for yourself, something secular. And that's an obligation to say the Shema. But if you are walking for a religious mitzvah, then you don't have to say the Shema. If you're walking not on your way, but just walking on the way to do something. And it's going to delve deeper into that. So Rabbi Blech writes, the implications of this phrase are treated elsewhere in the Talmud. Next come 2 additional statements clearly relating to place. And this is kind of what I was trying to explain. When you sit in your house and when you walk on the road, although those seems like extensions, Talmudic genius clearly recognized them as exclusions to the requirement to say the Shema. Had the text not defined the place where it would be incumbent to recite the Shema, the Talmudic requirement would obviously have been universal. Just say the Shema. Why then state when you sit in your house and when you walk in the road? The answer must be to exclude only when you sit and when you walk. That is, when you are obligated, but not in other circumstances. It's on the basis of this reasoning that the Talmud excludes 2 kinds of people from reciting the Shema. A person in the midst of performing a mitzvah and a groom, as we read before. So why a groom? Well, what's the first commandment in the mitzvah, in the Torah?
Pru
Urvu. Go multiply. Be fruitful and multiply. So on the wedding night, the groom doesn't have to say the Shema because he is doing something else. But an argument could be made, well, why not just say the Shema before that? And the Torah, recognizing how this young groom may be anxious or nervous, it actually says that his concern is a direct consequence of the law. Even if he is not physically performing that mitzvah, it says he's preoccupied with that mitzvah, and he doesn't have to say the Shema that night. So if someone has lost a family member that he's responsible to bury, can't say the Shema until that obligation is fulfilled and the person is buried, and he can't say the Shema on his wedding night. So there's an obvious question. Since that's a mitzvah on the wedding night, why does it have to come and say that person is excluded from the responsibility? Because it's a mitzvah, and we know that all the mitzvahs. So that's why it says that on the whole wedding night, even though he's not physically engaged in that act, even if he's preoccupied with that, if he's got his head somewhere else, that's also part of the mitzvah. And therefore, the reason it singles out a groom is because it's not just when you're doing the mitzvah, but when you are preoccupied with coming to do the mitzvah. So here's where we get into really some of the technical stuff. The Torah states, when you sit in your house, when you walk on your road, the Torah is referring specifically to the acts of sitting and going for one's own purpose. And that is when one must recite the Shema. When you're doing your own thing, when you're sitting in the house or when you're walking on your way doing your own thing, then you have to say the Shema. But if one sits and goes because of an involvement that transcends one's private interests and fulfills the will of God, then the Torah has taught through these extra words that you need not and should not recite the Shema. Do what you were already in the midst of doing. Do not shift from one mitzvah to another. More precisely, as we talked about last week, do not dare to evaluate God's commandment, forsaking one duty in order to perform another that you think is more important. So it really drives home that point, using the Mishnah and using the Talmud of why it's so important not to order which is a big mitzvah or a little one, that if you're doing one mitzvah, you can't stop that mitzvah to do the other. Not only that you don't have to, but that you can't. Any questions until now? So we're going to jump into the next chapter, which is called The Big and the Little. One word summarizes a parsha, the parsha Akev. Now, Akev sounds a little bit like the name, anybody? Yaakov. Yaakov. Steve, you're right. So, we talked about the words. So, Yaakov's name relates to the word heel. And we can that's a whole other class about why, but just know that. There's a whole chapter, or a whole portion, called heel. And it's an unusual term used to describe so it says in Deuteronomy, in that parsha, and it shall come to pass as a consequence of your listening to these ordinances and carefully carrying them out, that God will keep with you the covenant and the mercy which he swore to your fathers, and he will love you and bless you and multiply you. So the second word in that sentence is, in Hebrew, is Akev, that's the consequence, where the portion of the Torah gets his name. The root meaning of the word is heel. And why is such an unusual word used to describe the precondition for God's blessing, this consequence? So another source that we have is Rashi, who explains the Mishnah, explains the Torah, one of the premier commentators. He says, citing a midrashic source, so Rashi didn't make this up, but he got it from his tradition, is that even if the light mitzvah, which a person tends to trample with his heels, you will listen to, then you will be entitled to God's blessing. there are laws that people trample on because they assume they're not important. And for this reason, God says, I will bless you if you keep the minor ones, in the same way that you keep the ones that you consider major. And of course, there are no minor ones, but in our parlance, it may be a minor commandment. And the lesson here, the reason that the Torah uses the word consequence, the word akev, the word heel, is because it's alluding to if you keep the ones that you might otherwise trample on with your heel, you will get the reward. And this is where we get into the idea of gematria, the numerics of Judaism. And it sounds a little bit weird, but across the board you will find references to this. And it's part of the tradition of Jewish learning. It's not the basis of our fundamental beliefs, but it helped the words doing the numerology on the words kind of adds another layer to our understanding of it. Here, that word akev that we did, heel, refers to these simple laws that are often stepped on by the heels of man. So the way gematria works is each letter is assigned a numerical value. So A, B, C, A would be 1, B would be 2, C would be 3, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, 1, 2, 3. And then you get some higher numbers with later on letters. So the first letter of the word ayin, of the word akev is ayin, and that ayin letter has a numerical value of 70. Who's good at math here? Anybody?
Sure.
Okay. So we got 70 for the ayin. The second letter of the word is kuf, and that's 100. Akev. And the veit, or bait, is the second letter, is 2. So the word akev, ayin, kuf, vav, is
172.
172. Okay, it doesn't mean anything to me. It's important because the 10 Commandments, this very short discussion on some foundational things. And if you're not here now, come next week, because next week we're doing the chapter on the 10 Commandments. It will blow you away, I promise. It blew me away. It's the myth busting of the next chapter. I can't wait to do it. But let's focus on what's here and now before us. How many words do you think there are in the 10 Commandments? Anyone want to guess?
172.
172! Wow! What does that come to teach us? That the essence of the word akev, the heel, the little commandments that we tend to trample on, add up to 172. And the entire 10 Commandments are 172 words. Now, you may think that's a coincidence, but we could do maybe next year a whole class on gematria, on these numeric values. It is mind-blowing. And I'll tell you, there's a book that I read, Beyond Numeric Values, that the shape of each letter. So if Aleph has got this C and a line, we learn that so one example, the first letter in the Torah is a bet. And from that, we could do a whole weeks-long course on the bet means something and has significance for the whole Torah, and the last letter, and the numerical value of each letter, and the numerical value of each word. In fact, in Jewish tradition, our name is meant to describe the essence of who we are. So when parents name their children, maybe they ought to think about, we're setting it up right now. But we see that throughout the Torah, is that people's names also allude to their character. So what's the big deal, 172? What a remarkable correspondence between the words considered most important and those dismissed because of their seeming lack of importance. It shall come to pass as a consequence, akev, of your listening to these ordinances. Blessing for the Jew is predicated upon the recognition that all mitzvos are to be treated equal. So again, we're doubling down on that concept. But we're going to go further. What if somebody wants to convert to Judaism? Does Judaism allow that? Does it encourage that?
No.
Doesn't encourage it? In fact, Judaism discourages conversion. Yet, as we'll see, it also encourages it. And as we learned from that story about my grandfather and the garbage cans last week, that just because Judaism encourages it and also discourages it does not mean it's a conflict. Of course it does. Well, let's get into why that's so. So we talked about the Mishnah, we talked about the Talmud. Now we're going to go into the Shulchan Aruch. That is the code of Jewish law, and that is more of a practical guide than a academic one, which the Talmud is very academic. It's valuable, but code of Jewish law is just here's what the law is. So the Shulchan Aruch gives us the requirements for a proper conversions. Let it be noted that the Jews discourage converts, but that is only because we know that once one joins the Jewish fold, one is responsible for observance of all of the mitzvot. If we were to accept into Judaism someone who has no intention of keeping the commandments, we'd actually be doing that person a grave injustice. We have to know that they plan to abide by all of the laws. So it says in the text, it will come to pass that God will be king over the entire world, and on that day God will be one and his name will be one. So in fact, we actually want to spread these ideas beyond just our own fold. We want them to be widespread ideas. So that's the idea where there is some universality to it, but we don't want to jump the gun. We don't want to do it prematurely. So the halacha, the operative law, is clear. We must discourage and encourage a prospective convert. Discourage, because if they're not committed to keeping all the laws, we're doing them an injustice. But over the long term, we actually want to spread these ideas globally. So the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, says, this is the translation of the text, when a Gentile comes to convert, you say to him, what did you see that made you come to convert? Don't you realize that at this time the Jewish people is oppressed, despised, and banished, and that much suffering is being visited upon them? Timeless words. If he responds, I know and I'm not worthy to join you, accept him immediately. So what do? You teach someone the foundations of Judaism, which are the oneness of God and the prohibition of idol worship, and talk to him at length about those, but also teach him some of the commandments, some that are easy, shooing away the bird, and some that are difficult. So it says, we must introduce the prospective convert to those mitzvot that are regarded as serious and to those that are considered light, and he has to affirm his commitment to both. To be a Jew means that you will respond with the same devotion to every single demand. So if someone says, I'm interested in converting for all these reasons, I think it's a great religion, and I know about Shema, and I believe God is one, and I'm not into idol worship, so can I do this? What do you mean, no cheeseburgers? I'll give extra tzedakah, I'll give extra charity. No. Okay, but the thing about the bird, shooing away the bird, that's not a big one, right? So let me do everything else, but I want to get both the bird and the egg at the same. Even the slightest mitzvah would disqualify somebody from going through the conversion process. Even though, while we say we want to discourage converts, we actually want to encourage it if the person can do it. But we don't want to put it on somebody. We're not going around seeking converts. But as this quote says, that we want to spread the word in the end of days about the oneness of God, you would think you want to encourage conversion, but only after you've gone through it with them and say, this means everything. So for those of you on the Zoom, we may be cutting out in a few minutes. So if that happens, I apologize. But here's, I think, the most fun part of the class. I promised we would do something about the Jewish preachers.
You could sign right back in. You could do it again. If you lose them, he could do another one and come back in.
I'll leave that for you. So we're going to talk about the preachers. So there were people that went around, itinerant preachers. They just went around traveling and telling stories that elucidated these ideas. And one of the most famous Jewish preachers, and the term for a preacher is the Maggid. It's like a storyteller, really, is what it is. And in the book, he cites one of the most famous preachers in Jewish history was the Maggid of Dubno, Jacob Kranz, who lived 1740 to 1804. His parables became world famous. His simple tales, quote-unquote simple tales, conveyed the most profound teachings. One of the famous parables summarizes our theme and clarifies its meaning. But I want to get into a separate parable of his, maybe a more global parable that I think illustrates the idea of what a parable is. And the Maggid of Dubno was known for having the perfect story, the perfect example to explain an underlying idea. And it amazed people. To this day, historically, he's a famous storyteller. His stories live on. People wanted to know, how do you always have the perfect story? You know what he said? I have a story for you. It's like why does a Jew always answer a question with a question? Why not? Right? So similarly here, the Maggid of Dubno was asked, how do you always have the perfect story? He says, I have a story. There was a young man, an archer, out in the woods, and he hit every target. I think that Zoom class just ended if you want to redo it. But he hit every target. And somebody was walking through the forest and saw a bullseye. Up here, down there, everywhere the target was, he didn't just hit the target, he hit the bullseye of the target. And finally, this person wandering through the forest was kind of following it until he saw a young man who hit every target. He said, you're such a young man. How is it possible that you hit every target right in the middle? And the boy said, it's easy. First I shoot the arrow, then I paint the target. So that is a classic story of the Maggid of Dubno that kind of explains that he's got all the targets there, and then the right example comes along for the story. But in this one that's instructive for our purposes, the Maggid of Dubno says that in a little shtetl, in a small Jewish poor community, there was a pious Jew. He found himself in indescribable poverty, unable to support his wife and children. Although deeply religious, he felt that he had no alternative but to steal so he could have food for his loved ones. How does a pious Jew go about stealing? He didn't know where to turn, so force of habit led him to a synagogue. It was there that he began to look around for something to take, but he knew in his heart he couldn't steal anything really important. So he searched everywhere, but refused to even consider taking the Torah scrolls themselves. That would be sacrilegious. The silver ornaments on the Torah scrolls, the prayer books or the Bibles, they were too holy, too significant. If only there was something that was not so important. It was a beautiful synagogue by the standards of this poor shtetl. It didn't have any fancy furniture, but there was a magnificent chandelier hanging from the ceiling, which lit up the room with spiritual rays emanating from God himself. That was the feeling that this chandelier gave them. Light with which to study, to read prayers to the Almighty. Light with which to study from God's holy books. Light with which to illuminate the entire world. From that light, he sought to find something, anything, or even the slightest value. He lowered his expectations. If there was something worth just a ruble, it's always a ruble in these shtetls. He found nothing on the main floor of the synagogue, so he went up to the attic to look up there in the dark. He began to probe, fingers touching. And then, miracle of miracles, his fingers felt a small screw on the ground. It was made of metal. Surely he'd be able to sell it for scrap. It wouldn't be much, but might allow him to buy a piece of bread. And most significant of all, he would not really be stealing anything of value. So he reached and he began to loosen that small, insignificant screw. And no sooner did he manage to undo most of it than he heard a thunderous crash. It only took a moment to realize that what had fallen was the chandelier, the most costly object in the synagogue, all because he had undone the screw that held it in place. The little thing that, in retrospect, carried with it so much more than he could have ever have realized. What a powerful message. he had to take something to feed his family, but he didn't want to take anything important. So he went up to the attic to find a piece of metal. And there are small things attached to far greater objects, holding them in place and ensuring that they give light to the entire community. What is a little mitzvah? And who can tell how much effect its removal may have on the total picture? Some years ago, the 13th space launch of the U.S. shuttle program met disaster. Scientists combed the debris and found that a faulty O-ring was responsible. That small item caused the death of the astronauts and millions of dollars in damage and set back the whole space program. It's just an O-ring, not an expensive piece of technology. Who is to judge what is small and what is large? Who are we to decide what these commandments, what order they came in terms of importance? And so I think the lesson here, as we've been going through, is that these commandments came from the commander, from God. It's not for us to decide which one is important, which one is not important. It's not for us to decide which one do we stop doing for another one. The one we're doing is the one that we keep doing until we're done with it. And even in the case where you want to take something, where you think you're taking something little, you may be unscrewing the chandelier that gives light to the whole synagogue. It's not our place to make that decision. So I just want to remind everyone that we're learning the merit of Aviva Galia Bas Sima for a speedy and quick recovery. I think tonight's class was fun, but next week we are going to be doing the 10 Commandments. And I can't wait to do it with you. It's gonna kind of shatter your illusions about the 10 Commandments and everything that I think you learned and everything that I learned. But when you can shatter that illusion, it opens the way for a much deeper understanding of everything else. I'll leave it at that. So thank you.
I hope this worked.